Friends, the headlines this week, they haven't been great. We've heard of climate change-driven heat waves with record-setting stretches of extreme heat and flooding and fires and more smoke hazes. We've heard the growth of active club hate groups in the US, the dangers of artificial intelligence, the suspension of a grain deal between Russia and Ukraine that puts millions at risk of hunger. And depending on which paper you read, zombified trank addicts are swaying in the streets. Of course, the news was not all bad. The Barbie movie finally came out this week. And by almost all accounts, has lived up to its months-long hype. Perhaps that delightful, clever, genuinely funny, subversive, and warm-hearted distraction couldn't have dropped at a better time. The groaning of creation is palpable right now, and signs of the fear, anxiety, and despair that can easily set in when our foundations are shaken, when suffering rests at our door. Those signs are showing up around us with increasing frequency. We know the fear, anxiety, and despair are here, not only because we might be feeling those emotions within ourselves, but because we are witnessing their impacts within our community and among the people we love. In this community alone, in the past 2 weeks, no less than a half dozen of us have been called upon to provide care and support to friends, colleagues, and loved ones who were contemplating or took action towards self-harm. 3 separate senior adults jumped to their deaths in Manhattan this past week. 2 of them were from right here in the southern part of this Upper West Side neighborhood. My family, we lost one of our own beloveds when he took his life back in June. At PJ prayers and summer study group discussions this week, it's been clear that as much as we want it to be, this isn't necessarily a summer season that feels particularly light and breezy and refreshing and renewing for many of us. Many hearts, they feel heavy with worry. Fortunately, today's 2 lectionary texts, they're pretty good ones for moments such as these. In different ways, they remind us that we are never alone in what we're experiencing, both because of God's constant presence and because in every generation, humans and all of creation before us, they have faced instability and violence and suffering due to both natural and human-produced causes. It's very tempting to look at our current moment and consider it unprecedented. But it's not really unprecedented. It's just a part of being human. Now, if you don't believe me, consider what was happening in the year 536. We're going to go back a little bit, which medieval historian Michael McCormick, who chairs the Harvard University Initiative for the Science of the Human Past, he calls it, and I quote, 536, the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year ever. In his book, 536 beats out 1349, when the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, In 1918, when the Spanish flu killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, many of them young adults. According to Ann Gibbons from science.org, in 536, and I'm quoting here, a mysterious fog plunged Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into darkness, day and night, for 18 months. Snow fell that summer in China, crops failed, people starved. Then in 541, the bubonic plague struck the Roman port of Pelusium in Egypt. What came to be called the Plague of Justinian spread rapidly, wiping out 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire and hastening its collapse. Now, my husband has spent a fair amount of time reading up on 536, and he told me that Gibbon's description here is actually way too mild. And it doesn't really scratch the surface of the depth of despair people living at the time would have been experiencing. Darkness was literally and figuratively everywhere. And yet, despite complete upheaval in the political, economic, and social systems of the time, Christianity, along with many other faith traditions, survived. I imagine the faith traditions that survived because even though the faith of those living during that time was surely shaken, the practices of those traditions provided spiritual sustenance that enabled human survival by offering hope and comfort in the face of extreme suffering. In our Christian tradition, it's a sustenance that can be found in living what Paul calls life in the Spirit. But what was Paul really saying when he talked about living in the flesh versus living in the Spirit? We know parts of our tradition have taken some unfortunate interpretive and practical turns by reading his words as a body-soul dualism, and then using the text to serve anti-body ideologies, to undergird purity culture, or to encourage practices of extreme asceticism. But it's more likely that a metaphorical use of the terms flesh and spirit is what Paul was doing here. It's important to remember that all of Paul's letters would have been written to audiences living under the reach of the violent and oppressive Roman Empire. And this particular letter is written to early house churches that had sprouted up right in the seat of the empire. It was written in part as encouragement to live at odds with the death-dealing ways of Rome, as encouragement to reject the cultic activities of the imperial cult that required emperor worship, among other things. But I imagine Paul couldn't exactly say that outright, if you know what I mean. Like, you don't go into the emperor's backyard and, throw shade directly at the emperor. So life in the flesh pointed to a life rooted in the ways of the Roman Empire. Life in the Spirit, that pointed to life rooted in the ways of God. The Reverend Dr. Moynia Stubbs, in her book, Indebted Love, expounds on this distinction when she explains that to live according to the flesh is, and I'm quoting here, to live according to the flesh is a mindset or an imagining framed by idolatry or the absolutizing of one's own interests, with no regard for the interests of others. This is ideology as power games, self-promotion, and self-aggrandizement that ultimately denies human dignity and destroys human capacities for love and peace. Modern psychologists would also probably call this an ideology rooted in human ego needs, our needs for survival and security, esteem and affection, power and control. But a life lived in the Spirit, that reflects something different. It reflects a worldview where one imagines, and I'm quoting the Reverend Dr. Stubbs here again, where one imagines oneself in relation to others and one's conditions of existence from the perspective of God. Let me say that again, where one imagines oneself in relation to others and one's conditions of existence from the perspective of God. Do you remember that change in perspective Pastor Lee talked about a few weeks back? Getting up on their desk chairs in their classroom. I thought of it immediately when I was reading Reverend Dr. Stubbs' words. Such a worldview transforms us and leads us to the renewal of our minds. It draws us out of ourselves, out of being driven exclusively by our ego needs, and it moves us into communion with God and with one another. It's an important transformation because when we get too caught up in our own ego needs during the push and pull of the process of the world being the world, we not only create fear and anxiety and emotional turmoil for ourselves, we actually become a part of the push and pull, and we reinforce it. I don't know about you, but I am anything but my best self when I am feeling anxious and afraid. I withdraw from relationships. I'm short-tempered. I assume the worst of everyone in every situation. I shame spiral. I get jealous and graspy. I lose my capacity to believe in God's steadfast love for me. I lose my capacity to believe in God's steadfast love for all of humanity, for all of creation. Just as Stubbs wrote, I lose my capacity for love and peace. So what do we do when we find ourselves spiraling in these ways? When the news of the day or the week or the year or our own life experiences overwhelm and push us towards that fleshy mindset? What we do is we get back to basics by rooting in the practices of our tradition. I'll share with you a couple of the practices I call upon, which are actually inspired by one of Paul's other letters, his letter to the Philippians. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. So what do I take from that? First, talk with God, my friends. Cry out with God. Write with God. Sing with God. Dance with God. Sit with God. Breathe with God. Let God in on everything you are feeling and experiencing. I used to think there wasn't much point to that. I mean, if God is intimate with all my ways, and if a word is not even on my tongue before God knows it, why does expressing it matter? What I've learned is that it matters because it draws us into communion with God. Prayer, in whatever form it takes for us, empowers us because it initiates and invigorates our connection with the divine. It brings us to an awareness of the active presence of the Spirit in the world, and it helps us uncover the seed of the divine that is planted within. And perhaps counterintuitively, the more we recognize the seed of the divine planted within, the better we become at releasing those ego-centered behaviors that ultimately keep us at odds and out of relationship with one another. An active awareness of divine presence with and within us and within one another invites us into that shift in frame, that broader perspective that unbinds us and leads to more liberating patterns of behavior in our shared life. The other thing I do is I practice gratitude, and not just towards God. While that's a great place to start, we got to practice gratitude out in the world as well. Say thank you often and out loud, and really think about what you're appreciating when you say it. Write your thank yous too. The practice of maintaining a daily gratitude journal, it gives me something to look back on, and it continuously moves me out of a mindset of scarcity. It's that mindset of scarcity that we've been talking about in our summer study that Heather McGee says leads us to, quote, willingly buy into a zero-sum model to gain a sense of freedom that rises with the subordination of others, end quote. The practice of gratitude reminds us of God's abundant love and brings us into awareness of the interconnectedness of our lives to all lives. It's an awareness that encourages us to experience freedom through mutual upbuilding rather than pushing others down. All right, friends, I have shared mine. I think that's enough. You don't need any more of me. It's now time for you all to share yours. What other practices of our tradition encourage and sustain you and root you in hope? What practices of our tradition draw you into a life in the Spirit? Whatever they are, don't keep them to yourselves. Check in on one another. Share them with one another. Encourage one another. Rely on one another. Draw one another into community. Draw one another into faith. It's not how we only survive, but it's how we thrive. Amen.